The gates didn't open. That was the first thing Celeste noticed. The iron gates of her own home standing closed against her in the pouring rain, and her husband's guard staring through the intercom camera like she was a stranger. Then she saw them. Lucian Vale, her husband, the man she had built 7 years of her life around, walking another woman through the front door of their home, his hand pressed against the small of her back. Comfortable. Familiar. Like he'd done it 100 times before. Celeste sat in her car with an ultrasound photo in her trembling hand, and she made a decision that would change everything. She drove away. By morning, she had vanished. And the man who thought he controlled everything lost the only thing that ever mattered. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel like a stranger in your own life, stay with me. This story is going to hit different. Subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The rain started without warning, not the kind that builds slowly, giving you time to pull over or duck into a doorway. This was the kind that arrived all at once, a wall of water dropping from a sky that had been holding it for weeks, slamming against windshields and flattening grass, and turning quiet city streets into rivers in under 3 minutes. Celeste Arden had been driving for 40 minutes before the storm caught her. She hadn't planned to go to the estate tonight. She'd told herself that 100 times on the highway, rehearsing reasons to turn around. She was tired. It was late. Lucien would be in a meeting or on a call or standing in some corner of a room full of men who scared her in ways she'd learned not to think about. He always had a reason why tonight wasn't the right time. But she had the photograph. She kept it on the passenger seat, face up, even though she already had every detail memorized. The small curve of a spine, the barely there flutter of a heartbeat, frozen mid-movement by the ultrasound machine. The date stamp in the corner that meant nothing to anyone except her and the doctor who'd handed her a tissue and said, "Congratulations," in a voice so gentle it almost made her cry right there in the office. She hadn't cried then. She was crying now, though she wasn't entirely sure when that had started. The estate appeared through the rain like something out of a painting. Iron gates, stone walls, a long driveway lined with old oaks that Lucian had told her were there when he bought the property, that he'd kept them because she'd said she liked them. She'd forgotten she ever said that. She wondered sometimes if he remembered things she'd forgotten, stored them somewhere in that locked-down mind of his like receipts he might need later. She pulled up to the gate and lowered her window. Rain hit her immediately. She squinted against it, found the intercom button, pressed it. The guard who answered, Marcus, she recognized his voice, didn't say hello. He said, "Mrs. Vale." Not a greeting, a statement, like he was confirming something. "Marcus, it's raining," she said, because she didn't know what else to say. "Can you open the gate?" A pause that lasted 3 seconds too long. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vale. I have orders." She blinked water out of her eyes. "Orders?" "Yes, ma'am." "Marcus." She kept her voice even. She'd learned to do that, keep the surface calm even when everything underneath was churning. "I live here." "I understand that." "Then open the gate." Another pause. "I can't do that tonight, ma'am. I'm sorry." She sat with that for a moment. The rain was loud enough that she almost had to shout. Her hair was soaked through. She could feel cold water running down the back of her neck, and she had the sudden, absurd thought that she should have worn a heavier coat. "Did my husband give you those orders?" Marcus didn't answer. That was its own answer. She almost drove away right then. Almost. She had her hand on the gear shift and everything. But something made her look toward the house, some instinct she couldn't name, and that's when she saw them, the front door of the estate opening. Lucian stepping out under the covered entrance, shielding himself from the rain with the ease of a man who moved through the world expecting accommodations. And beside him, a woman. She was tall and dark-haired, and she walked with the kind of confidence that didn't come from trying. She said something to Lucian, and he smiled, actually smiled, the real one, not the polite version he wore in public. His hand found the small of her back, and she leaned into it slightly, the way you lean into something familiar, something you know won't pull away. They went inside. The door closed. Celeste realized she'd been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, all at once, and the sound that came with it wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't anything she had a name for. Her fingers found the ultrasound photograph on the passenger seat. She picked it up carefully, like it might break, and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she put the car in reverse. She didn't look at the gate again. She didn't look at the house. She drove back down the outer road in the pouring rain with both hands tight on the wheel and the photograph tucked back beside her, and she didn't allow herself to think. Thinking would come later. Right now, she just needed to get somewhere that wasn't here. She'd been driving for maybe 8 minutes when the first text arrived. She didn't see it right away. Her phone was in the cup holder, face down, and she wasn't going to look at it while driving in a storm on a road she didn't entirely know. But when it buzzed a second time, and then a third, rapid, insistent, she reached for it at a red light and turned it over. 3 messages. Unknown number. The first said, "They know you were there tonight." The second said, "You need to stop driving and get somewhere safe right now." The third said, "They're already behind you." Celeste looked up at her rearview mirror. A pair of headlights. Far back. Not close. But there. Had they been there before? She couldn't remember noticing them before the messages. She told herself she was being paranoid. She was upset, her emotions were running high. She'd just watched her husband walk another woman into their home while she sat in the rain with proof of his child on the seat beside her. Of course, her mind was going to catastrophize. She put the phone down and drove through the light when it turned green. 4 minutes later, her engine died. Not gradually. Not the cough and sputter of a car running out of gas or overheating. It just stopped. 1 second she was doing 45 on a stretch of industrial highway with no shoulders and no streetlights, and the next second the dashboard went dark. The engine cut out, and she was coasting in silence with her hazards not even working because the electronics were completely dead. She managed to steer to the edge of the road through sheer luck. The car rolled to a stop with the front tires half off the asphalt, tilted slightly into a drainage ditch, and she sat there in the dark and the rain with her heart slamming against her ribs. She grabbed her phone. No signal. She stared at the bars, zero, all zero, and then back at the road. The headlights she'd seen before were gone. That should have made her feel better. It didn't. She had maybe 3 choices. Stay in the car and wait, which meant sitting on a dark highway in a storm with no hazard lights. Walk back towards the city, which was a long way on a road with no sidewalk and no light, or call for help some way. But she had no signal, and the car electronics were dead, which meant no OnStar, no anything. She was still working through those options when she saw the figure. At first she thought it was a utility worker, someone in dark clothing standing at the edge of the road 50 yards ahead, near one of the old industrial access gates that lined this section of highway. Then she realized the figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. Then it started walking toward her. Celeste grabbed the door handle, then stopped herself. If she got out of the car, she was in the rain with no light and no weapon. If she stayed in the car, the doors were unlocked and the car was completely powerless. She looked in the back seat. Her umbrella. A reusable grocery bag. A cardigan she'd been meaning to take inside for 3 weeks. The figure was still walking toward her, closer now. The rain was too heavy to make out a face, but she could see a jacket, gloves, and something in the right hand that the person was keeping close to their body. She made a decision. She grabbed the ultrasound photograph off the seat, shoved it inside her coat pocket against her chest, opened the driver's door, and ran. Not toward the road. Away from it, toward the narrow strip of scrubland and tree line that ran along the far side of the drainage ditch. She hit the wet grass and nearly went down immediately. Her shoes were not made for running on mud in the dark. Caught herself, kept going. Behind her she heard a door slam, heard boots hitting pavement, heard someone moving fast. She ran harder. The trees gave her cover almost immediately. That was the thing about instinct. Sometimes it was smarter than thinking. She ducked into the dark between 2 large oaks, pressing her back against the bark, and forced herself to breathe through her nose, quietly, even though everything in her wanted to gasp. The footsteps stopped at the tree line. She heard her pursuer moving parallel to her position, searching without entering, as if they didn't want to follow her into the dark. She didn't understand why, but she stayed still, and after a long moment that felt like 20 minutes but was probably 40 seconds, the footsteps retreated. A car engine started somewhere on the road, then quiet. She waited another full minute, counting in her head, before she moved again. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the branches she used to navigate deeper into the trees, away from the road, in what she hoped was the general direction of something. A road. A building. A light. Anything. She pressed one hand against the outside of her coat pocket, feeling the slight stiffness of the ultrasound photograph through the fabric. Survive, she told herself. That was the only word she had room for right now. Survive. Back at the estate, Lucian Vale was doing what he always did when he wanted to avoid thinking too hard about something. He was working. He sat at the long table in the study with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, going through reports on his organization's Eastern warehouse operations. Numbers and projections and personnel notes. The kind of thing that required enough attention to keep the brain occupied without requiring actual emotional energy, which was the entire point. He was not thinking about Celeste. He was absolutely not thinking about the fact that she hadn't called in 4 days, which was the longest they'd gone without even an accidental text since they'd been married. He was not thinking about the particular way she'd looked at him 3 weeks ago when he'd canceled dinner for the 3rd time in a row, the way she'd nodded like she'd already expected it and had just been waiting for confirmation. He was not thinking about any of that. The knock on the study door was his assistant, Reeve, a man who had been with Lucian for 9 years and who had the singular useful quality of being able to deliver bad news without visibly bracing for a reaction. Reeve opened the door, stood in it, and said, "We found an abandoned vehicle on the industrial highway off Meridian, registered to Celeste." Lucian looked up. "When?" "20 minutes ago. Traffic unit flagged it. One of ours heard the plates on the scanner." Lucian was already standing. "She was driving it?" "The car is empty. Engine's dead. No signs of—" Reeves stopped, chose words. "No signs of immediate harm. No signs of—" Lucian's voice came out different than he intended, quieter, more controlled, which was actually worse, and both of them knew it. "She was here tonight, at the gate." Reeve went very still. "Sir?" "Marcus didn't tell me. I gave standing orders 3 weeks ago that—" Lucian stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because finishing it would have required saying out loud what those orders were and why he'd given them and what they'd actually meant in practice. "She was here. She came to the house, and she left, and now her car is abandoned on a highway 20 minutes away." Reeve said nothing, which was the right call. "Get me a car." Lucian was already moving, already pulling on his jacket, already doing the mental recalculation that happened automatically whenever a situation went from theoretical to real. "And get Marcus in here, tonight. I'll call the team. Get me a car first. I'll call the team myself." He was almost at the door when Reeve said, "There's something else." Lucian turned. The responding unit who found the car. Reeve held out his phone. A photo on the screen, taken inside Celeste's abandoned car, through the open door. The passenger seat. Something small and white and rectangular, slightly crumpled from water damage, left behind in whatever happened when she'd gotten out of that vehicle. Lucian took the phone and looked at it. He recognized what it was immediately. He'd seen them before, at a hospital visit years ago for something unrelated. He knew what that particular kind of photograph meant. The ghostly gray image, the measurements printed along the side, the date stamp. He stood with his assistant's phone in his hand and felt something happen to him that had nothing to do with strategy or control or any of the things he was good at. It was just impact, pure structural impact, the kind that comes when information arrives that rearranges something fundamental. She had come to tell him. She had driven through a storm to his front gate in the rain, and his men had turned her away under his orders. And she had been carrying this. She had been carrying proof that everything he'd told himself wasn't possible was not only possible but already real, already a heartbeat, already a date on a printout, and she'd wanted to tell him, and he had not been available. The word that came out of him was quiet and specific and very, very cold. "Get me the car," he said. "Now." The night shift at Lucian's Security Operations Center was usually quiet. 3 monitors, 1 operator, rotating shifts of 2. Standard surveillance for a man who'd spent 20 years making enemies and spent just as long making sure those enemies couldn't get close enough to act on it. The operator on duty that night, a young man named Cole, who had been with the organization for 18 months and had never seen anything more serious than a fence breach, was the one who first noticed the anomaly in the phone records. Celeste's movements over the past 6 weeks had been logged, as they always were, because Lucian's security protocol required tracking the personal phones of all family members for their own protection. It was standard. It was documented. Every member of the household was briefed on it when they joined. What was not standard was the fact that those logs had been accessed 3 times in the past month by someone without the clearance to view them. The access timestamps. The location coordinates pulled from Celeste's phone history, her doctor's appointments, the clinic visits that, when Cole lined them up against the date on the ultrasound photograph, formed a timeline that somebody had clearly already assembled before tonight. Somebody had known. Before she drove to the gate. Before she came to tell Lucien. Before the car died on the highway and the figure walked toward her from the darkness, somebody inside the organization had already been building a picture of Celeste Arden's life, her location, her schedule, her vulnerability. Cole reached for his radio, then stopped. He looked at the access logs again, looked at the authorization code attached to the intrusions, a code he recognized because he'd seen it on paperwork, on authorizations, on the signed orders that came down through channels so established they felt like they were carved into stone. The code belonged to one of the oldest men in Lucien's organization. Cole sat with that information for 30 seconds, which felt like a long time to sit with something like that. Then he reached for the phone and called Lucien directly. He didn't go through channels. That decision, small, instinctive, made by a 26-year-old who was probably going to get reprimanded for bypassing protocol, was the decision that started everything unraveling. When Lucien answered, Cole said, "Sir, I need you to look at something. I think someone inside the organization helped plan what happened to your wife tonight." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Lucien said, "Don't touch those logs. Don't tell anyone else. I'm coming to you." Cole looked at the screen. The access code looked back at him. He thought about the man that code belonged to, the particular face, the particular handshake, the particular way that man had patted Cole on the shoulder at a company event 8 months ago and told him he was doing good work. The way that had made Cole feel, briefly, like he belonged somewhere. He sat very straight in his chair, kept his hands flat on the desk, and waited. Outside, the rain kept coming down. Somewhere in the city, in the dark, between trees she couldn't see and a road she'd run from, Celeste Arden was still moving. She had the photograph pressed against her chest with one hand. She had no idea what was behind her. She only knew one thing with the kind of certainty that doesn't need thinking, the kind that lives in the body, not the mind. She was not going to stop. She found the road by sound, not sight. The trees were too dense and the rain too heavy for that. But sound. The specific hiss of wet tires on asphalt carries differently than rain hitting leaves or rain hitting dirt. And Celeste had grown up in a house near a highway, and her body still remembered that sound even after 20 years of living somewhere else. She followed it the way you follow something you know without knowing how you know it, pushing through branches that grabbed at her sleeves and stepping over roots she felt rather than saw. When she broke out of the tree line, she was on a different road entirely. Narrower. Better lit. A gas station sign glowed orange and white maybe 300 yards to her left. She walked toward it with her arms wrapped around herself, soaking wet, one shoe making a sucking sound where the heel had pulled loose from the wet ground at some point in the dark. The photograph was still pressed against her chest, inside her coat. She could feel its edges through her shirt. The gas station had one attendant, a heavy-set man in his 50s who looked up from his phone when she pushed through the door and immediately said, "Lady, you okay?" "Phone," she said. "Can I use your phone?" He handed it over without another word. She stood at the counter, dripping water onto his floor, and tried to figure out who to call. Not Lucien. The thought arrived and she dismissed it before it finished forming, which hurt in a way she didn't have room for right now. Not her sister, who lived 2 states away and who she hadn't spoken to honestly in 3 years. Not her friend Dana, whose husband worked for Lucien's legal team, which meant there were loyalties there that Celeste had always chosen not to examine too closely. She called a cab company. Old number she still had memorized from before she'd had a driver. The dispatcher told her 40 minutes. She handed the phone back and stood by the door and watched the road. The attendant brought her a paper cup of coffee without being asked. She looked at it for a second before taking it, and something about that small, unrequested kindness made her throat tighten in a way the whole night hadn't managed yet. "Thank you," she said. "You want me to call someone?" he asked. "Police, maybe?" She thought about that, really thought about it, what it would mean to call the police, what she would say. What she knew about Lucian's relationships with certain precincts, certain captains, certain men in positions that were supposed to be about the law but had become, over years, about something more complicated than that. "No," she said. "I'm fine." He didn't look like he believed her, but he went back to his phone and she went back to watching the road, and neither of them said anything else for 38 minutes until the cab arrived. She gave the driver the address of a hotel she'd stayed at once for a work conference years ago, before she'd married into a life where hotels weren't necessary. The kind of place with a doorman and a front desk that didn't ask too many questions about why a woman was checking in at 11:15 at night with no luggage, wet hair, and mascara somewhere near her chin. She paid cash from the emergency money she kept folded in the lining of her wallet, something her mother had told her to always do, always keep cash somewhere they can't trace. They being the vague, threatening force that her mother had spent a lifetime preparing for without ever quite defining. Celeste had laughed about that once. She wasn't laughing now. She got a room on the 7th floor, locked the door, put the chain on, sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the ultrasound photograph out of her coat and looked at it under the lamp. Still intact. A little damp at one corner. The image itself untouched. She set it carefully on the nightstand, face up, like she was tucking it in. Then she put her face in her hands and let herself feel it, all of it, the whole night at once. The gate and the rain, and Lucian's hand on that woman's back, and the figure on the highway, and the trees and the running and the photograph and the coffee from a stranger, and the fact that the most important thing she'd ever had to tell her husband, she still hadn't told him, and she cried until she was empty. Then she stopped, washed her face, found the hotel robe in the closet, sat back down on the bed with the photograph and a notepad from the nightstand and started writing down what she remembered about the figure on the highway. Height, clothing, the thing in their right hand, the way they'd stopped at the tree line like they knew the dark was hers. She didn't know what she was going to do with what she wrote down. But she was going to write it down anyway. Because whatever tonight was, affair or coincidence or something she didn't have a name for yet, she was not going to face it without paying attention. Cole was still at his desk when Lucian arrived at the operations center. He'd been there for 40 minutes since the call, and he had not touched the logs, exactly as instructed. What he had done, because he was 26 and thorough and slightly terrified, was make a mental inventory of every access point the intrusion had used, every timestamp, every piece of data pulled from Celeste's location history, not writing it down, not copying it anywhere, just building a map in his head that he could deliver intact. Lucien walked in with 2 men behind him, neither of whom Cole knew by name. He'd seen them before, the kind of men whose job was to stand near Lucien in situations that might require standing near Lucien. They positioned themselves at the door without being told to. "Show me," Lucien said. Cole turned back to the screen and walked him through it. He kept his voice level and his hands visible and his explanations short. The access timestamps. The specific data fields pulled, not just location, but the clinic name, the appointment type, the duration of each visit. The way those pulls had been made in a pattern that suggested someone wasn't just checking on Celeste, but building a comprehensive picture over time. Lucien stood behind him and watched the screen without touching anything. Cole couldn't see his face from this angle, which was probably intentional on Lucien's part. "Whose code?" Lucien said. It wasn't a question. Cole had prepared for this moment. He'd rehearsed 3 different ways of saying it. All 3 evaporated when he opened his mouth, and what came out was just the name, plain and undecorated. Harlan Voss. The room didn't change. Nothing visible shifted. But something happened in the air, the particular quality of silence that occurs when a name lands on someone with the weight of a history Cole could only guess at. Harlan Voss, Senior Operations Director, 18 years with the organization. The man who had, by all accounts Cole had absorbed in 18 months of working there, been one of the architects of what the organization became. The man who sat at Lucien's right hand at every serious meeting Cole had ever been in proximity to. "You're sure," Lucien said. "The code is registered to him specifically. It can't be shared or—" "I know what the code is." A pause. "You're sure it was used, not just assigned to someone else temporarily?" The biometric confirmations are attached to each access. It was his fingerprint. Another silence. Longer this time. One of the men at the door shifted his weight. Lucien said without turning, "Don't." They went still again. "Where is she?" Lucien said. "Right now. Where is Celeste?" Her phone is still showing no signal. Last ping was on the industrial highway, same location as the car, but that was, Cole checked the screen, over an hour ago. She doesn't have signal, or she turned the phone off? I can't tell from this. If it's dead, the battery's gone. If she turned it off, Lucian said, with the certainty of someone who understood exactly why a person would do that. She turned it off because someone texted her from an unknown number, and she figured out the phone was how they were tracking her. Cole looked at the screen. He hadn't made that connection yet. He made it now. Who sent those texts? He said. The warning text she got. Lucian finally moved, stepped around Cole's chair, and picked up the printed log from the desk where Cole had set it earlier. He scanned it. His face was doing something complicated that Cole didn't have the experience to fully read. Somewhere between rage and something that might have been the wreckage of something else. Someone who knew what was coming, Lucian said. Someone who knew early enough to warn her. That means there are at least two factions inside the organization. That means, Lucian said, setting the paper down carefully, that this has been going on longer than tonight. He looked at Cole directly for the first time. Who else knows what you found? No one, sir. I called you directly. Good. He reached into his jacket pocket and set a phone on the desk next to Cole's keyboard. A fresh phone, still in the thin plastic wrap. You're going to use this from now on. Your regular phone goes in the drawer and stays there. You don't contact anyone in the organization through standard channels until I tell you it's safe to. You understand? Cole looked at the fresh phone. Yes, sir. If anyone asks why you're on a new number, you dropped yours in the sink. People believe that. He turned to go, stopped. You did the right thing, calling me directly. He said it without warmth, but Cole believed it anyway. It was the kind of statement that didn't need warmth to be true. Lucien left. The two men at the door followed. Cole sat alone in the operations center with his new phone and his mental map and the access logs on the screen, and he thought about Harlan Voss, who had patted him on the shoulder 8 months ago and told him he was doing good work. I thought about what it meant when the people you trusted turned out to be building something behind the walls of your trust, using it like scaffolding. He thought about a woman running through trees in the rain. He opened a new monitoring window and started pulling every camera within a mile of where her phone had last pinged. He was going to find her before anyone else did. Lucian called Marcus from the car. Marcus picked up on the second ring. He sounded like a man who had been waiting for this call and dreading it, and had made a decision somewhere in the waiting to simply absorb whatever came. She was at the gate, Lucian said. Yes, sir. Tonight. In the rain. Yes, sir. And you turned her away. A pause. I had standing orders, sir. The orders said, I know what the orders said. Lucian's voice was still quiet, still controlled. It was the wrong kind of controlled, the kind that came not from calm, but from the decision to save violence for later. I gave those orders 3 weeks ago, when I had reasons that have since become irrelevant. What time was she at the gate? 8:47. What time did you report it to me? Silence. Marcus. I didn't report it, sir. Why? Another silence. Longer. The kind that happens when the answer is true and the truth is a bad one. Because Marcus stopped, started again. Because Voss told me not to. The car was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the city moved past. Wet lights, wet streets, the ordinary ongoing business of a night that had no idea what was happening inside this particular vehicle. Voss told you not to report it, Lucian said. He called me when she arrived at the gate. He said he already knew she was coming and he was handling the situation, and I should follow the standing orders without variation and not alert you until morning. And you listened to him. Marcus stopped again. He outranks me, sir. I had no reason to. He outranks you. Lucian said it back slowly, like he was examining each word separately. He outranks you. So when he told you not to inform me that my wife was at the gate in a rainstorm, in distress, you thought that was a reasonable thing to do because of organizational hierarchy. Marcus said nothing. Where are you right now? Lucian said. I'm at the gate, sir. I'm on duty until. Stay there. He hung up. He sat back against the seat and closed his eyes for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to let something run through him and burn out, not long enough to let it take control. 4 seconds was what he allowed himself. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the city again. He called his head of field operations, a woman named Sloan, who he trusted with the kind of operational execution that required both precision and discretion, which was a rare combination and one he paid accordingly. "I need teams on every camera in a 3-mile radius of the Meridian Industrial Stretch," he said when she picked up. "My wife's vehicle was found there. She fled on foot. I need to know where she went." "Understood," Sloan said. No questions, no comments. That was why he'd called her. "I also need a soft surveillance on Harlan Voss. Nothing that touches him. I want to know his location, his communications, and who he's been in direct contact with in the last 72 hours. Use people he doesn't know personally." A brief pause. "Harlan Voss." "Yes." "You're sure?" "I'm always sure when I say something to you," he said. "Otherwise, I don't say it." "Copy that," she said. "Give me 40 minutes. He hung up and looked out the window. He was still holding the phone in his hand that had the photo Cole had sent him. The ultrasound. He didn't look at it again. He didn't need to. It was already in him, sitting in his chest like a stone that had landed and wasn't going anywhere. He had ordered his men not to let his wife through the gate. He had given that order because of Naomi Cross, who had come to him 2 weeks ago with information he hadn't verified the way he should have, and he had made a decision based on that information that had felt, at the time, like security, like caution, like the rational management of a complication. The woman at the gate tonight. Naomi Cross, dark-haired and confident, walking into his home because he had invited her, not for what his guards might have assumed, not for any of the reasons Celeste might have seen in that moment through rain-streaked glass, but for information. For a conversation he told himself was necessary. He had not told Celeste. He had not told Celeste because he was bad at the specific kind of honesty that required explaining complicated things before they looked like simpler things. And because somewhere in the past 2 years he had gotten so deep into managing the world outside that he had stopped managing the world inside, which was the world that actually mattered, which was... He stopped. This was not useful. Retrospection was not useful right now. What was useful was finding her. He would carry the rest of it after. The call came into Harlan Voss's personal phone at 11:49. He was at his home office, a different kind of office than Lucian's, warmer, messier, full of the particular clutter of a man who has always had too many projects running at once. Books stacked sideways on shelves. An old photograph of his daughter on the desk, age 7, gap-toothed, squinting into a summer sun that was probably 20 years ago now. He looked at the number on his phone's screen and felt a specific thing happen in his chest, a tightening that wasn't fear exactly, but was its close relative. The number was one he'd been given 3 weeks ago by a man named Darius Cross, who had introduced himself as a business contact and whom Harlan had known, immediately and privately, to be something else entirely. He almost didn't answer, but not answering had its own consequences, and he was too far in for consequences to be acceptable. "She made it out," Darius said when Harlan picked up. "No greeting. She ran into the trees and your man lost her." "That's not my problem," Harlan said. He kept his voice low even though he was alone. "You said the operation was contained." "It was supposed to be. Your information was accurate. We had her route, her timing. The car shutdown worked exactly as planned. The problem was execution on your end." "My end." Harlan looked at the photograph on his desk. The gap-toothed girl. "I gave you what you asked for. I kept Lucian out of the loop tonight. I made sure the gate stayed closed. That was the agreement. The agreement was that she'd be secured tonight. She's not secured. She's somewhere in the city with no phone and no one knowing where she is, which is actually the worst possible outcome because it means Lucian is going to start looking." "He's already looking," Harlan said. "You should assume that. You should assume that by morning he knows the car was found and he's deployed every resource he has. Then we need to move the timeline." The timeline was already aggressive. "Harlan." The voice on the other end changed slightly. Not louder. Colder. "You are a man who has been stealing from Lucian Vale's organization for 3 years. Not large amounts. Small ones. Careful ones. The kind that disappear into line items. But I have the records. All of them. We've had this conversation." Harlan closed his eyes. "I know what you have." "Then you know what happens if I give it to Lucian." He did know. He'd been knowing it for 3 weeks, carrying it around like a tumor, going through his days with the weight of it somewhere behind everything else he did or said or thought. 3 years of small takings, Not greed. It had never been about greed. His daughter's medical bills. Her condition, chronic and expensive and merciless, in the way that certain medical conditions are merciless, taking and taking without apology. He had watched the numbers in his accounts do what numbers did, fall, keep falling, reach levels that made him sit at this same desk at 2 in the morning, doing arithmetic that never came out right. And he had made a decision. He had told himself it was temporary, that he would find another way, that Lucien would never notice because the amounts were small, and Harlan knew exactly how the books were kept and exactly where the blind spots were. He had told himself these things, and then 3 years passed, and it wasn't temporary anymore. It was just his life. And Darius Cross had walked into it with a smile and a dossier and an ask that started small and kept expanding. "She can't be harmed," Harlan said. "That was the condition I gave you from the beginning. Whatever you use her for, whatever message you're sending Lucien, she doesn't get hurt." "That depends on Lucien," Darius said. "That is not an answer." "It's the only honest one I have." A pause. "Find her, Harlan, before Lucien does. If she gets back to him first, tells him what she saw tonight, what she experienced, that's information he can use to trace the operation back. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand what you're saying." "Then make it happen." The line went dead. Harlan sat with the phone in his hand and looked at his daughter's photograph and thought about all the small decisions that had led to this exact moment. Not the obvious ones, not the one where he'd first taken money or the one where he'd first answered Darius Cross's call, but the older ones, the ones from years ago, the decisions about what kind of man he was going to be and what he was willing to do to protect the people he loved, and where the line was between protection and destruction, and how it was possible to cross that line so gradually that you never noticed the crossing, only the place you ended up. He put the phone down, picked up a different one, a burner he'd bought 3 weeks ago and kept in the false bottom of his desk drawer, dialed a number he'd memorized. "I need you to locate someone," he said when it was answered. "A woman. No phone signal. She was last at the Meridian Industrial Stretch. I need her found before morning." He paused, added, "Alive and unharmed. That is not negotiable. If she gets so much as a bruise that wasn't there before, the deal is finished." He hung up and sat back in his chair and felt the weight of his own history pressing down on him like weather. On the desk, his daughter's photograph looked back at him with that gap-toothed grin from 20 years ago, from before the diagnosis, from when things were simply and straightforwardly hard in the way that life is hard, rather than hard in this specific, cascading, irreversible way. He thought about Celeste, somewhere in the city without a phone, wet and alone, and carrying something he hadn't known about until the photograph had been pulled from her car and relayed to Darius, who had relayed it to Harlan with a comment that Harlan had not responded to because some things didn't deserve a response. He thought about what it meant that a woman had driven through a storm to tell her husband he was going to be a father and had been turned away at the gate by orders that Harlan himself had reinforced, had been thrown back into the night that someone else had already prepared for her like a trap, had run through dark trees with a photograph pressed against her chest. He thought about this for a long time. Then he picked up the burner phone again and sent a single text to a number he'd only ever contacted once before. A number that he knew, with the particular knowledge of a man who had spent 18 years inside Lucien Vale's world, went to someone inside that world who was still clean. The text said, "There is a traitor coordinating with Darius Cross. The traitor is me. Whatever happens next, make sure she survives it. That's all I'm asking." He stared at what he'd written, hit send before he could think about it longer. Then he opened the top drawer of his desk, took out the sealed envelope he'd written 3 weeks ago when this had all still felt theoretical, and set it in the center of the desk where it would be found easily. His daughter's name was on it. He didn't know what was going to happen in the next 24 hours. He didn't know which of the forces he'd set in motion would arrive first or what shape they'd be in when they got there. He didn't know if Celeste would be found, and by whom, and what that would cost, or what Lucien would do when the full picture assembled itself, which it would, because Lucien Vale had always been impossible to deceive for long, and the only reason it had worked this long at all was that Lucien had been looking outward instead of inward, at enemies instead of the house. What Harlan knew was this. The moment he sent that text, there was no version of tomorrow in which he was the same person he'd been at the start of tonight. He had just burned the last bridge between who he'd been and what he'd become. He sat in his office with his daughter's photograph and his sealed envelope, and his two phones and the rain against the window and the full weight of everything he'd done and chosen and failed to stop, and he waited for the world to catch up with him. It didn't take long. At 12:17 in the morning, his front door opened. He heard two sets of footsteps on the hardwood, precise and unhurried, the way men move when they already have the outcome decided and are simply fulfilling a formality by arriving. Harlan didn't stand up. He kept his hands flat on the desk, visible, and looked at the door of the office and waited. When it opened and Lucian Vale walked in, not Sloan, not a field team, but Lucian himself, which meant this had already escalated past delegation. Harlan looked at the man he had served and stolen from and sold out, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not fear, relief. The kind that comes when a secret you've been carrying alone finally has another person in the room with it. Lucian looked at him for a long moment, took in the desk, the envelope, the phones, all of it, with the systematic attention of a man who read rooms the way other people read faces. "Where is she?" Lucian said. Harlan looked at the envelope on the desk, looked at Lucian. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but I know who does." And then, for the first time in 3 years, Harlan Voss began to tell the truth. All of it, from the beginning, in the specific and irreversible way that truth arrives when there is no longer any reason to protect the lie. Harlan talked for 41 minutes. Lucian didn't interrupt him once. He stood in the doorway of the office for the first 30 seconds, then moved to the chair across from the desk and sat down, which was the chair Harlan had seen 100 visitors sit in over the years. People coming to Harlan with problems, with requests, with information. It was strange to be on the other side of that. Strange, and in the way Harlan had already identified, oddly clarifying. He started at the beginning. Not the beginning with Darius Cross, but the real beginning. His daughter's diagnosis, the bills, the arithmetic that never worked, the first time he'd moved money through a channel he shouldn't have touched. He kept his voice even and his hands flat on the desk, and he didn't look at the photograph of his daughter while he talked because he didn't deserve that comfort right now. Lucian listened with the particular quality of attention that Harlan had observed in him for 18 years. Not reactive, not visibly processing, just present, absorbing, storing, the kind of listening that felt like being read. When Harlan reached the part about Darius Cross, he watched something shift in Lucian's expression. Not much, just enough to see. "Darius Cross," Lucian said, the first words he'd spoken. "Yes." "Marcus Cross's son." "Yes." Lucian was quiet for a moment. "Marcus Cross has been dead for 4 years." "I know," Harlan said. "Darius blamed you for it. Marcus Cross died because he made a decision that killed 3 of my men, and I responded to it. That's not blame. That's consequence." "I understand that," Harlan said. "Darius doesn't." Lucian looked at the desk, at the sealed envelope with the daughter's name on it, at the 2 phones. He was doing the calculation. Harlan could see it, the way the mind behind those eyes was assembling the architecture of everything Harlan had just said into a structure he could act on. "He wanted her as leverage," Lucian said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Not to hurt her, to use her, to get you somewhere specific, in a specific emotional state, so that when you arrived you'd be—" Harlan stopped. "Compromised. Not tactically, emotionally. He wanted you to come for her instead of thinking. He wanted to make you into the kind of man who makes mistakes." "Where would he take her?" "He has a holding facility on the waterfront. Abandoned shipping warehouse. Eastern Docks. The block that's been in receivership since the Port Authority restructured. He bought it through 3 shells. I have the documentation." Harlan opened the top right drawer of his desk. Slowly, deliberately, so the men standing behind Lucian could see his hand the whole time, and pulled out a folder, set it on the desk, pushed it forward. Lucian didn't reach for it yet. "She's not there yet," Lucian said. "No, she wasn't secured, she ran." Something moved across Harlan's face. Celeste is not a person who stops moving. I should have told Darius that. She's not the kind of person who—" He stopped again. "I underestimated her. Here, I think Darius did too." "Who did he send after her?" 2 men. Local contractors, not his core team. If she lost them in the trees, they won't have recovered. They don't know the city well enough." Lucian finally reached for the folder, opened it, scanned the first page with the practiced speed of a man who had read thousands of documents and could locate the relevant information in seconds. He closed it, set it back on the desk. "Is there anything else," he said, "that you haven't told me?" Harlan thought about the text he'd sent, the contact, the single ask. Make sure she survives. "No," he said. It was the last lie he told. He told it not to protect himself, he was past that, but because the contact he'd reached was someone Lucian didn't know was clean, and if Lucian knew about it, he'd move on that person immediately, and then that person's ability to operate independently would be gone, and that independent operation might be the one thing that tilted the balance towards Celeste walking out of whatever was coming alive. Lucian stood. He picked up the folder, looked at Harlan one final time with an expression that wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier, but something closer to the specific grief of a man confronting a subtraction from his life that he hadn't seen coming. "Your daughter," Lucian said. "Her name is Iris." Harlan went still. "Yes. She's being treated at Mercy General. The specialist there is Elaine Cho." He paused. "I've known about the bills for 2 years, Harlan." The room was very quiet. "I was going to bring it to you," Lucian said. "I was waiting for you to come to me, because you are a man who has been with me for 18 years, and I thought—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I thought you'd come to me." Harlan looked at his desk, the sealed envelope, his daughter's name. He had nothing to say to that. There was nothing to say. There was only the particular devastation of learning that the thing you had destroyed yourself to protect was something that had already been within reach, if you had only been capable of asking. "Take him," Lucian said to the men behind him. "Not unkindly, not viciously, just factually, the way you state a thing that has to happen." Harlan stood. He didn't resist. He picked up the envelope from the desk, the one addressed to Iris, and held it out. "Can someone make sure she gets this?" he said. "Whatever happens, she should get this." One of the men took it. Lucian was already walking out. Harlan followed under escort into a night that felt like the logical end of a very long series of choices. And he did not look back at the photograph on his desk, because some things you don't get to take with you. Sloane called Lucian at 12:53 with the camera footage. She'd found Celeste on a traffic cam at the edge of the industrial district. Wet, walking fast, identifiable by her coat, and the distinctive way she held her arms crossed over her chest. Following the route forward across 3 more cameras, Sloane had tracked her to the gas station, then to a cab pickup, then, cab company records cross-referenced with dispatch logs, to the Carlisle Hotel on 5th. "She's there," Sloane said. "Checked in under her maiden name, paid cash, room 74 Fiend." Lucian processed this. The maiden name. The cash. The deliberate choices of a woman who was hiding, not from the people who'd come after her on the highway necessarily, but from everyone, including him, especially him. "Is she safe?" he said. "Right now. As far as I can tell. No one's gone in or out of that floor in the last 2 hours except hotel staff. Keep a team on the perimeter. Nobody goes in. Nobody approaches her." He paused. "She doesn't know they're there." Sloane understood. "And you?" He didn't answer that. He looked at the folder in his hand, the waterfront warehouse, Darius Cross. There was a sequence problem forming. If he went to Celeste now, she was safe, but Darius was still operational, still had a plan in motion, still had the network Harlan had described. Men who knew Celeste's name and face, and the hotel district she'd be most likely to retreat to. Removing Darius first meant leaving Celeste alone for longer, with only a perimeter team between her and anyone who might find her through channels Harlan hadn't known about. Waiting was a trap. Moving was a trap. He called Naomi Cross. She picked up on the 4th ring, and her voice when she answered had the particular texture of someone who had been awake and waiting, which told him she already knew something had gone wrong tonight. "You have 30 seconds to decide," he said, "whether you want to be the person who helps me find your brother or the person who protected him." A silence. Then, "He called me 2 hours ago." "What did he say?" "He said the operation was delayed. He said—" Her voice changed. Something cracked in it slightly. "He said he needed me to stay available, that he might need me to bring you somewhere." "Bring me where?" "He didn't say. Lucian, I swear he didn't tell me where." "Does he have a secondary location? Something he mentioned? An old property, a contact's address? Anything that isn't the waterfront. The waterfront, she exhaled. He told you about the waterfront. Someone else did. A pause. There's a boat, she said. He always had a boat. Even when we were kids after our father, it was the one thing he kept. He kept it at the harbor marina on the eastern waterfront. Slip 44, last I knew. He said water was the only place that felt honest. Thank you, Lucian said. Is she the woman, his wife? Is she? She's alive. He hung up. He called Sloane back, told her about the boat, told her to add it to the tactical map but not to move on it yet. Then he sat in the back of the car and looked out the window at the city and did the thing he was worst at, the thing that Harlan's confession had just stripped him of the ability to avoid. He thought about what he'd done. Not tonight. Before tonight. The accumulation of it. The dinners he'd canceled, the conversations he'd deflected, the particular art he'd developed over years of making Celeste feel like she was present in his life, while systematically excluding her from every part of it that mattered. The orders he'd given Marcus 3 weeks ago. The way those orders had been, in some real and structural sense, the first door in the chain of doors that had led to her running through dark trees in the rain tonight. He wasn't a man who spent much time in self-examination. He found it inefficient. But there was a difference between self-examination and accountability, and the thing pushing through him right now was accountability. Not the performance of it, but the actual physical weight of it, pressing on the center of his chest. He had a child. There was a heartbeat somewhere in the city that existed because of him, and the person carrying it was in a hotel room under her maiden name, hiding from the world, because he had made her feel like the world included him. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and breathed, and did not allow himself anything beyond those facts. Then he picked up the folder again and went back to work. Celeste woke at 3 in the morning to a sound she couldn't immediately identify. Not a knock, not an alarm. Something smaller, a shift of weight in the corridor maybe, or the particular way air moved differently when someone was standing on the other side of a door instead of walking past it. She was upright before she was fully conscious, which was something she'd noticed about herself in the months since her marriage had started fracturing. She'd developed a lighter sleep, a faster surface, the body adapting to a life that required more alertness than it used to. She stood in the middle of the hotel room in the robe, listening. Nothing. She looked at the door. The chain was on. She'd checked it twice before she slept. She looked at the nightstand, ultrasound photograph, hotel notepad with her written observations, the hotel phone. She crossed to the window, 7th floor. The street below was wet and mostly empty. A cab, a delivery truck, a man in a yellow jacket walking a dog. She scanned the building across the street, the doorways, the parked cars. A dark sedan, engine off, 2 cars back from the hotel entrance. She could see the faint orange point of a cigarette in the driver's seat. She watched it for 30 seconds. The cigarette didn't move. The person holding it was watching the hotel entrance the way someone watches something they've been told to watch, with the resigned patience of a job rather than the interest of a person. She stepped back from the window. 2 possibilities. Lucien's people, which meant he'd found her, which meant either she was safe or the definition of safe had just become more complicated. Or Darius Cross's people, which meant something else entirely. She needed to know which. She picked up the hotel phone and dialed the front desk. "This is room 714, she said when it was answered. "I think there's someone outside my door. Can you have security check the 7th floor corridor?" A brief pause. "Of course, Mrs. Just check the corridor," she said. "Please." She hung up and stood in the center of the room and waited. 60 seconds later, she heard footsteps in the corridor, the particular gait of someone who worked there, efficient and unbothered, and then silence, and then the footsteps returning. No one had been there, which meant the presence she'd sensed was gone now, or had never been there, or was good enough to not be found by a hotel security officer doing a courtesy check. She looked at the chain on the door. She was not going to stay here until morning. That had seemed like a reasonable plan at midnight, and it was not a reasonable plan anymore. Whoever had sent those texts warning her on the highway, someone who knew what was coming before it came, might also know where she'd gone. And if Darius Cross's network was as organized as the night had suggested, they had enough resources to check hotels in the district, check cab company logs, check security cameras. She had maybe 3 hours before this room became a liability. She needed to move, but moving meant choosing a direction, and every direction available to her had a problem attached to it. Back to her sister, 2 states away, no car, no working phone, which she needed to fix first. To a friend. But which friend? And was any friend outside Lucian's world completely? And could she be sure? To the police. And she'd already had that conversation with herself at the gas station. She thought about what Lucian would do, not because she wanted his judgment, but because she'd lived in proximity to his thinking long enough to have absorbed some of its logic. And that logic was sometimes useful in situations like this. He would identify the most defensible position. He would move to it before the threat consolidated. He would not wait for the threat to come to him. She got dressed, put the hotel robe back on the hook, put the ultrasound photograph in the inside pocket of her coat again, took the notepad with her observations and folded it into the same pocket. She looked at the hotel phone one more time. Then she picked it up and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. A number she'd told herself she didn't need anymore, belonging to a person she'd told herself she'd outgrown, which was the kind of thing you told yourself when you were trying to fit inside someone else's life, and the people from your old one didn't fit the shape. The phone rang 4 times. A woman answered, half asleep. "Hello?" "Dana," Celeste said. "I know it's 3 in the morning. I need help and I can't explain why yet. Can you come get me?" A short silence. Then Dana, who had known Celeste since they were 22 and shared an apartment with a broken radiator and a view of a parking structure, said, "Where are you?" "Not what happened. Not are you serious. Just where are you?" Celeste told her. 20 minutes, Dana said, and hung up. Celeste sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the door and breathed and waited. Dana arrived in 18 minutes, which meant she'd driven faster than she should have, which was one of the things about Dana that Celeste had missed without fully realizing it. She was wearing a coat over pajamas, and her hair was up in the kind of knot that happens when you're not quite awake yet. And she took one look at Celeste in the lobby, the coat, the missing heel on the left shoe, the careful blankness of a face that had been through something, and she didn't say anything. She just held out her arm, and Celeste took it, and they walked out to the car. They drove for 10 minutes before Dana spoke. "Your face," Dana said. "You ran somewhere." "Trees," Celeste said. "Okay." Dana kept her eyes on the road. "We're going to my sister's place. She's in Connecticut through the weekend. It's clean. It's not connected to me professionally." She paused, and in that pause, Celeste understood that Dana was already accounting for the Lucian variable, already drawing lines around connections. And no one who knows either of us has the address because she just moved. "Dana, don't explain yet. I don't need it yet. Just sit." Celeste sat. The city moved past outside the windows. The rain had finally slowed to something manageable, a fine mist rather than the wall of water that had swallowed the earlier part of the night. Celeste watched streetlights leave streaks on the wet pavement and held her coat closed with one hand and felt the photograph inside the lining. "He was with someone," she said. "Tonight, at the house." Dana didn't answer immediately. "Okay." "I went to tell him something important, and the guards wouldn't open the gate, and I watched him walk in with her, and I left." She paused. "And then someone tried to grab me on the highway." The car slowed very slightly, then maintained speed. "Those 2 things are connected," Dana said. "I think so." "Connected how?" "I don't know yet." Dana nodded, kept driving. Her hands on the wheel were steady and unhurried in the way of a person managing a strong reaction through the discipline of paying attention to the road. "The important thing you were going to tell him," Dana said carefully. Celeste reached into her coat pocket and held out the photograph without saying anything. Dana glanced at it, back at the road. A long pause. "Oh, Celeste." "Yeah." "Does he know?" "No, that was why I went tonight." She folded the photograph back into her pocket. "I don't know if I'm going to tell him now. I don't know anything now. I just need to be somewhere safe for long enough to think." "My sister's place," Dana said. "You can think there." They drove the rest of the way in the specific silence of 2 people who have known each other long enough that silence isn't uncomfortable. It's just another kind of being together. Lucien's tactical meeting convened at 2 in the morning in the back office of a building he owned through a subsidiary, far enough from the estate that it functioned as a clean room. No regular operations, no standing staff, no history that Darius Cross's intelligence could have mapped. Sloan was there. Two field team leaders named Rook and Carver, both of whom had been with the organization long enough to have been tested in situations that required both discretion and a high threshold for operational pressure. Cole was patched in remotely through the fresh phone Lucian had given him, his voice slightly compressed through the speaker but clear enough. "The waterfront warehouse is the primary," Lucian said. He had the folder open on the table. Harlan's documentation, cross-referenced with the satellite imagery Sloan had pulled in the last hour. Harlan's intelligence on the layout is 2 months old, which means it's accurate for the structure and possibly inaccurate for the personnel distribution. We treat the personnel numbers as unknown. "Best estimate?" Rook said. Harlan indicated 8 to 12. "Assume 15. Assume they're expecting a response, but not necessarily the timing." "Do they know about Harlan?" Sloan said. "Darius Cross knows Harlan's operation failed tonight. He doesn't know Harlan has confessed. There's a window, possibly narrow, in which he still thinks Harlan is a controllable asset and not a blown one." Lucian looked at the map. "That window closes when Darius tries to contact Harlan and gets no response, or when one of his people confirms our team is moving." "How long?" Carver said. "Hours, maybe less." Lucian paused. "There's a complication." The room went quiet in the specific way it went quiet when Lucian used that word, which he used rarely and with precision. "Naomi Cross," he said, Darius's sister. "She came to me 2 weeks ago with intelligence on a competing organization, intelligence that turned out to be accurate, which is why I trusted it. She also told me, at that time, that she was estranged from her brother, that she'd broken from the family after their father's death." He paused. "Harlan's timeline suggests she made contact with Darius 3 weeks ago, before she came to me." Sloan looked at him carefully. "So, she was sourced by Darius." "That's the most likely interpretation. She fed me accurate information. Information Darius had no reason to protect, from an organization he'd already decided to sacrifice, in order to establish credibility, in order to make me trust her enough to keep her close." He stopped. "And to give her a reason to be at the estate tonight, in a position where Celeste would see her." The silence this time was different, more loaded. Cole's voice came through the speaker. "He engineered the scene at the gate." "Yes," Lucian said. "He needed Celeste to see something that would make her leave the estate emotionally compromised, driving alone, on a route his men already knew. He needed her distressed and isolated." He looked at the table. "He needed me to be the reason she drove into his trap." No one said anything. Lucian looked up. "That's what this is. He didn't just want to take her. He wanted me to hand her over without knowing I was doing it. He wanted the damage to come from inside my own house." He closed the folder. "I need to know where Naomi Cross is right now." "She's at a hotel," Sloan said. "I've had a soft eye on her since you called me earlier. She hasn't moved since midnight." "Bring her in," Lucian said. "Quiet. I need to know what she's actually told her brother about tonight, what she knows about the secondary location, what else she's been feeding him." "You think she'll talk?" Rook said. "I think," Lucian said, "that she already talked once tonight. She gave me the boat." He picked up the folder. "She's deciding. People who are deciding can be tipped. The question is which way." He looked around the room. "We move on the warehouse before dawn," he said, "but we need to know what Darius knows first, which means Naomi Cross has the next 2 hours to finish deciding." He was walking toward the door when Cole's voice came through the speaker again. "Sir, there's something else." Lucian stopped. "I've been running the camera footage from the industrial stretch forward, looking for Darius's contractors, the 2 men who followed Mrs. Vale. I found them." "Location." "That's the thing." A pause. "They didn't go back to the waterfront. They went to a hospital, Mercy General." Another pause. "I pulled the visitor logs. They signed in as—" Cole's voice changed slightly, the particular change of someone reading something carefully before saying it, family members of a patient named Iris Voss. The room went absolutely still. Lucian turned around slowly. "Harlan's daughter," Sloan said very quietly. "They went to her," Lucian said. Not a question. The arithmetic assembling itself in real time. Darius knew Harlan would break. He knew Harlan would talk when the operation failed, so he sent men to the hospital as a contingency, as a message. He looked at Sloan. "Get someone to that hospital. Now. Not later. Right now." Sloan was already on the phone before he finished the sentence. Lucian stood in the center of the room with the folder in his hand and felt the full geometry of what Darius Cross had built. The architecture of it, how many layers deep it went, how long it had been under construction, how many people's vulnerabilities had been mapped and cataloged and stored like ammunition. Harlan's theft, leveraged. Naomi's grief over her father, leveraged. Lucian's own emotional negligence, weaponized. Celeste's love for a man who hadn't deserved it, used as bait. And now a sick girl in a hospital bed, used as a leash on a man who had already confessed. He thought about what Harlan had said. He wanted to destroy you emotionally before killing you physically. He understood now what that actually meant. It wasn't just about Celeste. It was about this moment, standing here with the knowledge that every person Lucian Vale cared about, even imperfectly, even badly, had been identified and positioned and was now a pressure point waiting to be pressed. Darius Cross had spent 4 years since his father's death building a machine specifically designed to dismantle Lucian from the inside out, and until tonight, it had been working perfectly. Lucian set the folder on the table, the version of himself that handled things through intermediaries, through channels, through the careful maintenance of distance between decision and consequence. That version was not equipped for this. That version had, in fact, contributed to building the conditions that made this possible. He looked at Sloane. Change of plan. She lowered the phone slightly. Sir? I'm going to the warehouse myself, he said. I'm leading the team. The room moved in a way that rooms moved when something unexpected but not entirely surprising was said. A collective recalibration, small physical adjustments, the silent revision of assessments. The risk profile on that, Rook started. I know the risk profile, Lucian said. I've known it longer than you have. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Darius Cross built this to make me the kind of man who reacts instead of thinks. So I'm going to give him exactly what he built for, and I'm going to be standing in front of him when he realizes it didn't work the way he planned. He looked at each of them in turn. Get me armor. Get me a weapon I can actually use in a confined space. And someone call the hospital and make sure Iris Voss has a guard on her room before those 2 men get anywhere near her floor. He was already moving toward the door when Sloane said quietly, and Mrs. Vale. He stopped with his hand on the door frame. She's safe, he said. She moved. She's not at the hotel anymore. You don't know where she is? A pause. No. Lucienne. Sloane's voice was careful. She almost never used his first name. If this goes wrong tonight, if something happens to you before she knows what's happening, she's out there alone with no information, no security, a target that's still active. She doesn't know any of this. He stood in the doorframe for a long moment. He thought about the hotel room she'd been in, the maiden name, the cash, the deliberate choices of a woman who was protecting herself because the person who was supposed to protect her had made himself unavailable. He thought about her driving through that storm with the photograph on the seat beside her. He thought about what she'd said to Marcus through the rain. I live here. He turned around. Draft a message, he said to Sloane. Everything she needs to know to stay safe and stay hidden until this is over. Who to trust, who not to trust, what's actually happening, and why. No operational details. He paused. And tell her... He stopped. Started again. Tell her the child is the reason I'm doing this right. Not the only reason. But tell her she should know it's part of it. Sloane nodded. How do I reach her? You can't, he said. But Dana Reyes can. She'll have found Dana by now. She always does. He turned back to the door. There were hours left before dawn. And somewhere on the eastern waterfront, in an abandoned warehouse that smelled of salt water and old metal, Darius Cross was waiting for a man to arrive broken, desperate, and alone. A man so wrecked by what he'd been shown and what he'd lost that he'd make mistakes, walk into traps, give Darius the ending he'd been writing for 4 years. Lucian stepped through the door. Darius Cross was about to discover that grief. When it stopped being private and became structural. When it became the thing you built your next action on instead of the thing that paralyzed you, was not a weakness at all. The eastern waterfront at 4 in the morning had the particular quality of a place that had forgotten what it was built for. The old shipping district had been dying for years before the Port Authority restructured. Warehouses going dark one by one, chain-link fences accumulating rust, the water between the docks black and still in the way that water gets still when no one is moving through it regularly. The kind of place that showed up in city planning documents as under review and stayed that way for a decade while nature and neglect ran their quiet competition. Lucian's team came in from 3 directions. 8 people total, split into positions that Sloan had mapped on the satellite imagery. 2 on the roof access from the adjacent structure, 2 covering the loading dock exits on the south face, 4 moving through the primary approach with Lucian. Everyone in dark clothes, everyone in radio earpieces, nobody using lights they didn't have to. Rook was at Lucian's left shoulder. He'd been in enough of these situations to move without instruction, to read the environment and adjust without consultation, which was the only kind of person Lucian wanted next to him right now. They covered the first 100 yards of open ground between the fence line and the warehouse in 90 seconds, moving low and fast across cracked concrete that crunched with broken glass and debris. The sound of the harbor was everywhere, water against pilings, something metal knocking in a slow rhythm somewhere deeper in the dock complex. Normal sounds, not alarmed sounds. That didn't mean anything, it just meant nothing had broken yet. At the warehouse's eastern wall, Lucian pressed his back against the concrete and listened. Voices inside. Indistinct, too muffled by the wall to resolve into words, but there, more than 2 people, less than 10, in the middle section of the building rather than the far end. He held up 3 fingers to Rook without looking at him. Rook nodded. Both of them had just revised the interior estimate downward from Sloan's 15, not reassuring. Fewer bodies sometimes meant more preparation. The side door was padlocked with a new lock on an old hasp. The hasp itself was rusted into the doorframe, which meant the structural integrity of the entire mechanism was the weak point. Rook handled it in 4 seconds with a tool that made a sound like a branch snapping, and then they were inside. The smell hit first. Salt, rust, oil, and underneath it, something chemical. Not industrial chemical, something specific, the kind of smell that lived in places where generators had been running. The darkness was almost total. Lucian pulled on a set of low-light lenses, and the interior resolved into the gray-green landscape of available light, amplified. Concrete floor, structural columns, old conveyor infrastructure, running along the ceiling, pallets stacked against the far walls. And partway through the space, through a gap in the stacked pallets, the dull orange glow of a work lamp. He moved toward it. He was 15 feet from the gap in the pallets when the gunshot came from above and to the right. Not aimed at him, aimed at the ground 3 feet to his left, kicking up concrete, a warning shot that said, "We see you with the particular clarity of live fire." Lucien was already dropping, already rolling left toward the column cover, and Rook was going right, and the team behind them was dispersing without a word because they'd trained for exactly this. The moment when the entry goes wrong and the plan becomes a set of principles rather than a sequence. Lucien came up behind a column with his weapon drawn and his back against the concrete and listened to the darkness above him for the position of the shooter. Second level, structural walkway that ran along the north wall. He'd seen it in the satellite imagery, had flagged it as a potential problem, and had decided the approach timing made it manageable. He'd been wrong about the timing. Vale. The voice came from the direction of the work lamp, not the shooter. Someone else, farther in, confident enough to use his name. You moved faster than I expected. Lucian didn't answer. The team on the roof access found my people up there about 40 seconds ago, the voice continued, so we're past the part where either of us pretends this is going to be quiet. A burst of sound from the far end of the warehouse. Sharp, compressed, ending fast. Then one of his roof team's voices in his earpiece. Roof is clear, 2 down, we're coming to the south entry. My timeline, the voice said, just changed. Lucien moved. Not toward the voice, laterally, using the columns for cover, working his way around the perimeter of the pallet stacks toward the glow of the work lamp. He could hear Rook moving somewhere in the dark behind him, covering his angle without being told. The shooter on the walkway fired twice more, both into empty space, tracking movement that wasn't there. Lucien had changed direction twice without sound, and the shooter was working on old information. He came around the last pallet stack and stopped. The work lamp was sitting on a folding table in a cleared space at the center of the warehouse. At the table, standing with his hands visible, and his posture carrying the specific kind of calm that was either fearlessness or performance, was a man Lucien recognized from photographs, because he'd never met him in person, had only known him as the son of a man he dealt with 4 years ago. Darius Cross was 40 years old and looked like someone who'd spent those 40 years being underestimated. Medium height, unremarkable face, the kind of person you'd pass in a hallway and not look twice at, which Lucian understood, professionally, was often a cultivated quality rather than a natural one. And behind him, 3 armed men. And behind them, a door, steel reinforced, closed. Lucian kept his weapon on Darius and swept the room in the same second, counting positions, angles, the distance to each armed man, the structural cover available. He was calculating survival probability with the automatic part of his brain while the rest of him landed on the door. "She's in there," Darius said. He hadn't moved his hands. He was watching Lucian's eyes do the calculation and seemed unsurprised by it. "She's been in there since 1 this morning. She's cold and tired and she's scared, but she's not hurt." He paused. "I want you to know I kept that part of the agreement." "What agreement?" Lucian said. "The one I made with Harlan." Darius's expression was level. "He gave me her movements. I gave him my word she wouldn't be harmed. Harlan's in custody." "I know." Something shifted in Darius's face. Not surprise. "He called your ops center kid directly, didn't he? I wondered if he'd do that." He tilted his head slightly. "Which means the fingerprint access was flagged before I had a chance to—" He stopped. Reconsidered. "It doesn't matter now." "Where's the shooter on the walkway?" Lucian said. "Still there, but his orders are to hold unless I say otherwise." Darius looked at him steadily. "I want to talk, Lucian. That's why I'm standing here with my hands where you can see them." "You want to talk?" Lucian said. "After you sent men to grab my wife on a highway. After you leveraged a sick girl to control her father. After you spent 4 years building a machine specifically designed to break me down from the inside." "Yes," Darius said simply. "Because the machine worked, and you still came here, and I want you to understand why I built it." "I don't need to understand why, but—" "My father," Darius said. The 2 words landed with a weight that stopped the room. "I need you to understand what you took from me. Before anything else happens here, before this goes any further, I need you to understand that." The earpiece in Lucian's left ear moved with ambient sound, his team repositioning, taking angles, waiting for the signal. Outside somewhere, his roof team was coming through the south entry. The armed men behind Darius could hear it too. Their hands tightened on their weapons. They were waiting for the same signal from a different source. The next 30 seconds were the most fragile 30 seconds Lucian had been in since he was 22 years old, and first learning what it felt like when everything could go wrong at once. "You have 30 seconds, he said. Darius looked at him. "Your people killed my father. Your father killed 3 of my men first. He was protecting his territory. You were expanding into it without warning. 30 seconds, Lucian said. Don't waste them explaining what I already know." Darius's jaw tightened. "He raised me. After my mother left. He raised Naomi and me alone, in the kind of life that doesn't give you the option of being anything except what it makes you. And he was—" He stopped. "He wasn't a good man. I know he wasn't a good man. But he was ours. He was the only thing we had that was ours. And you took him, and you moved on, and you kept building, and nothing stopped for you. Nothing." His voice cracked slightly at the edges. "Nothing in your life registered that my father was gone from the world." Lucian looked at him. "And your plan," Lucian said, "was to make me feel that. Make me register a loss big enough to match yours. Yes, by taking my wife. By taking my child. The child you knew about. The photographs Harlan pulled from her medical files. You knew." "I knew." "And you thought the appropriate response to your grief," Lucian said, and his voice was very quiet now, the dangerous kind of quiet, "was to hand me a version of the same thing. I wanted you to understand what loss felt like." "I understand what loss feels like," Lucian said. "I've been in this business longer than you've been running it. I know exactly what loss feels like." He paused. "The difference is, I don't use other people's children to make a point about it." Something collapsed in Darius's face. Not dramatically. It was a small collapse, an internal one, the kind you saw in a person's eyes before it reached their expression, like a structural failure that hadn't yet reached the surface. Then one of his men moved. Not on instruction, Lucian saw that immediately, saw the absence of any signal from Darius, saw the man's own decision happening in real time. The calculation that the conversation had gone long enough and the tactical window was closing. The man brought his weapon up, and Lucien was already moving, already dropping his shoulder, and the shot went over him and hit the column behind. Then the warehouse came apart. Rook came out of the dark behind Darius's right-side man with the economy of someone who had been holding that position for 90 seconds and knew exactly what he was going to do. The earpiece filled with voices. North wall clear, moving south, one shooter on walkway still active, do not have the shot. And Lucien was up from the floor and driving forward, not toward Darius but toward the reinforced door, because the door was the only thing that mattered right now. Everything else was noise. The third man intercepted him 6 feet from the door. He was bigger than Lucien, younger, and he came in without hesitation, which meant he'd been in enough of these situations to have lost the particular hesitation that kept civilians alive. He caught Lucien across the shoulder with a forearm that had real weight behind it, spinning him left, and followed it with a grab for the weapon hand. Lucien let him take the hand. He let him take it because the other option was a direct contest of strength that he wasn't going to win, and because the moment someone controlled your weapon hand, they stopped thinking about your other hand, and the elbow he drove into the man's jaw with his other arm had all his body weight rotating behind it, and the man dropped like the connection between his brain and his legs had been temporarily severed, which was approximately what had happened. Lucien hit the door, steel reinforced, locked from outside with the bolt mechanism. He found the bolt with his hands, not his eyes, sliding his palm along the door frame until he felt the cold cylinder of the bolt handle and drove it left. The door swung open. The space inside was a former storage room, concrete walls, concrete floor, a single battery-powered lantern in the corner throwing yellow light that made everything look slightly wrong. The smell was cold, the deep cold of an unheated interior on a wet night, the kind that got into your clothes and stayed. She was sitting against the far wall. Her arms were around her knees. Her coat was still on, and she'd pulled it tight. Her hair was dry but tangled, and there was a mark on her left cheekbone. Not from tonight, Lucien registered. Not a fresh injury, just the bruised shadow of exhaustion under the skin. Her shoes were dirty, the left heel still broken from running. She looked up when the door opened. She didn't move. She looked at him the way you looked at something you weren't entirely sure was real yet, with a stillness that wasn't shock, but was its careful cousin. "You came," she said. 2 words. Flat. Not grateful, not accusing, just acknowledging. Lucien crossed the room and crouched in front of her. He didn't touch her. He looked at her face, her hands, checking with the systematic attention of someone who needed to confirm something before they could keep functioning. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She paused. "My shoe is broken." "I see that." "There was no heat in here." "I know. We're leaving now." She looked at him for another second. Then she stood. Without his help, she stood herself up, using the wall, and straightened her coat and put her hand in her pocket, and he saw her feel for the photograph and confirm it was there, and something happened in his chest that he had no word for. "Can you run?" he said. "I've been running all night," she said. "Yes." Behind him, the warehouse was loud, voices, movement, the concentrated chaos of a fight that was ending rather than escalating. Lucien took her arm, not pulling her, just contact, the offer of guidance she could accept or reject, and moved them back toward the door. In the main space, the 3 armed men were down. Rook was covering 2 of them. The third was against a column, held by one of the team members who'd come in through the south entry. The shooter from the walkway was on the floor near the work lamp, his weapon 10 feet away, his hands behind his head under instruction. Darius Cross was standing exactly where Lucien had left him. He hadn't run. He hadn't fought. I was standing with his hands still visible, watching Lucien come out of the storage room with Celeste, and his expression had the specific quality of a man who had reached the end of a very long road and was looking at what the end actually looked like. Celeste stopped when she saw him. She looked at Darius for a moment. Then she looked at Lucien. She didn't ask. She was reading the room the same way she'd always read rooms, with the quiet attention of someone who had spent years in proximity to complicated situations and learned to orient quickly. "Go with Rook," Lucien said to her. "Outside. The car is at the south fence line." "Lucien." "Please," he said. Word was different than his other words. She heard it. He saw her hear it. She went with Rook. Lucian turned back to Darius. They were 6 feet apart in the orange light of the work lamp with the controlled chaos of Lucian's team operating around them. And Darius looked at Lucian with the expression of a man who had prepared for 100 different versions of this moment and was now living in the version he hadn't prepared for. The version where the machine worked and the person inside it didn't break the way it was designed to break him. "She's going to be all right," Darius said. It wasn't a question. It sounded almost like relief, which was the strangest thing Lucian had heard all night. "She was always going to be all right," Lucian said, "because I was coming regardless of what state you put me in. I wanted you to feel it." Darius's voice was stripped of everything now: strategy, composure, the calculated distance he'd been maintaining. What was underneath was just tired. Just a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally put it down, and the putting down was neither triumph nor relief, but just cessation, the stopping of effort. "I wanted you to know what it was like to almost lose everything." "I know what it's like," Lucian said. "I've been losing things all year and I was too busy to notice." Darius looked at him. "Your father," Lucian said. "I'm not going to tell you it was justified. It was necessary. And those aren't the same thing, and you're allowed to know that and be angry about it." He paused. "But you used Harlan's daughter. You were going to use my child. Whatever your grief is, wherever it lives, that's not grief anymore. That's something else." "I know," Darius said quietly. "Then put your hands behind your back." Darius looked at him for one more moment. Then, without argument, without a last performance of resistance, he moved his hands behind his back. It wasn't defeat. It was something closer to a man who had finally, after 4 years, put down something he'd been holding so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. Lucian cuffed him with a cable tie from his jacket pocket and handed him to the team member nearest the south entry, and then he walked out of the warehouse into the pre-dawn gray of the eastern waterfront. Celeste was standing at the south fence line beside the car. Rook was 3 feet away, giving her space, not looking at her. She was looking at the harbor, the flat black water, the running lights of a cargo vessel somewhere in the middle distance, the faint beginning of something lighter on the far horizon that wasn't yet dawn but was the idea of it. She heard him coming. She didn't turn. He stopped beside her. They stood for a moment at the fence line, with the harbor in front of them and the warehouse behind them, and the sound of the water against the pilings in the quiet. "The baby," he said. She was quiet for a second. "Still there." Her voice was careful. I've been able to feel something, not movement, just presence." She paused. "The doctors need to confirm." "We're going to the hospital," he said. "I know." She still wasn't looking at him. "Lucien," she stopped. "Don't say anything yet. Not tonight. I need you to just not say anything that either of us is going to have to live with tonight." He understood what she meant. There was a conversation coming. Not a small one, not a quick one. The kind of conversation that required both of them to be somewhere other than a waterfront at 4:30 in the morning after the night they'd both just had. "Okay," he said. She finally turned and looked at him. He was still in the tactical gear, still had the low-light lenses pushed up on his forehead, still had blood on the back of his left hand from somewhere in the warehouse that he hadn't noticed until just now. He was looking at her the way he hadn't let himself look at things in a long time, directly, without management, without the careful distance he'd built around every important thing in his life until the distance became the thing itself. She looked at the blood on his hand, looked at his face. "You're hurt," she said. "It's minor." "Let me see." He held out his hand. She took it, not gently, not dramatically, just took it and turned it toward the light and looked at the cut across his knuckles. A split from the impact with the man at the door, not deep, already crusting over. She pressed the pad of her thumb along the edge of it with the concentrated attention of someone who needed something concrete to do. "It needs cleaning," she said. "At the hospital," he said. She held his hand for another second, then she released it. She turned toward the car. He stayed one moment longer, looking at the harbor. The cargo vessel's lights moved slowly in the darkness, tracing their own slow geometry across the black water. The horizon was definitively lighter now. Not dawn yet, but committed to it, the sky making a promise it would have to keep in the next hour. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in a hospital room, a man named Cole was probably still at a monitor. An 18-year-old girl named Iris was asleep with a guard outside her door and a sealed envelope addressed to her on the nightstand. Naomi Cross was in a room somewhere answering questions about her brother with the tired precision of someone who had made her decision and was living in the consequences. Harlan Voss was in custody in a building that smelled like old coffee, sitting across from a table with his hands flat and his conscience finally, after 3 years, bearing its own weight without assistance. And in a car at the south fence line, Celeste Arden was sitting in the back seat with her hand in her coat pocket, feeling the edge of a photograph through the lining, breathing slow and even and waiting. Lucian turned away from the harbor. He walked to the car and got in beside her without a word, and the car moved, and the waterfront fell behind them, and neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Then she said, without preamble, without anything to introduce it, "I was so angry at you." He looked at her profile in the dark of the car. "I was so angry," she said again, "that I drove through a rainstorm to tell you something instead of calling, because I needed to see your face when I told you. I needed to see if it would matter to you." She was quiet for a moment. "And then the gate and that woman and I thought, he doesn't even know I'm standing here. He doesn't know I exist in the same way I know he exists." Lucian said nothing. "And then someone tried to grab me," she said, "and I ran. And I kept running." She turned and looked at him. "And in those trees, in the dark, I wasn't thinking about you or about being angry or about any of it. I was just thinking about staying alive. And staying alive felt like something I wanted to do. For the first time in a long time, it felt like something I actually wanted." He looked at her. "That's what I want you to understand," she said, "before anything else. Before whatever you were going to say, I need you to understand that I got through tonight on my own. I was already surviving before you got there." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I know that," he said again. "I was never coming to rescue you. I was coming because you're the only person in my life I failed every single day for 2 years. And I needed to be the person who showed up. Even if it was too late. Even if it didn't count for anything, I needed to show up." She looked at him for a long time. The car moved through the pre-dawn streets of a city that was just beginning to remember itself. The first delivery trucks, the first lights in apartment windows, the accumulated ordinary life of a place that had no idea what had just happened in its darkest corner. "The doctor's name," Celeste said finally, "is Reeves. She's on the 4th floor of Mercy General. She knows me." "I know which floor," Lucian said. She almost said something, stopped. "Of course you do." The car moved on. The horizon ahead was finally, unmistakably, beginning to hold the first suggestion of color, the particular gray-pink of a sky deciding to become morning, slow, and non-negotiable, arriving the way things arrived when they had been coming for a long time and could not be rushed. Inside the car, neither of them reached for the other's hand, but neither of them moved to the far side of the seat either. And in the dark between them, something that had not been present at the start of the night, something small and fragile and entirely without a name yet, was still, improbably, Mercy General's 4th floor smelled the way hospitals always smelled at 5 in the morning. Antiseptic and old coffee and the specific stillness of a building that never fully slept but had its own version of quiet. The fluorescent lights in the corridor were turned down to their overnight setting, casting everything in a slightly yellowed half-light that made the walls look older than they were. Dr. Reeves met them at the elevator. She was a small woman in her late 40s with the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough middle-of-the-night arrivals that she no longer registered the hour as unusual. She looked at Celeste first, the broken shoe, the tangled hair, the careful way Celeste was holding herself, like a person who had been running on adrenaline for hours and could feel the bottom approaching. And then she looked at Lucian, and whatever she made of him, she kept it behind a professional neutrality that Celeste had always appreciated about her. "Come with me," Reeves said. "No preamble, no questions yet." She took them to an exam room on the far end of the corridor, away from the other occupied rooms. Celeste sat on the examination table, and Lucian stood near the door with his hands at his sides, and Reeves ran through the assessment with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and what she needed to rule out first. Vitals. Fetal heart rate monitor. Ultrasound. The sound that filled the small room when Reeves found the heartbeat was not dramatic. It was small and fast and entirely steady. a wet, rhythmic percussion that had no interest in the events of the night that had surrounded it. It simply continued, the way it had been continuing, doing the only thing it knew how to do. Celeste closed her eyes. Lucien did not move from near the door, but Celeste heard him exhale, a long, slow release of breath that was the only sound he made. And she didn't look at him, because looking at him right now would have required more of her than she had left. "Everything looks good," Reeves said, in the quiet, certain voice of someone delivering information she was glad to deliver. "Heart rate is strong. No signs of stress beyond what I'd expect given—" She glanced at Celeste. "The circumstances." "Thank you," Celeste said. "I want to keep you here for a few hours, monitoring. Nothing alarming, just precautionary." "Okay." Reeves looked at Lucien. "There's a waiting room at the end of the hall." He understood. He looked at Celeste once. She was looking at the ceiling, her hand flat on her own stomach, listening to the monitor. And he went. The waiting room was empty except for a man Lucien recognized as one of Sloane's perimeter team, sitting in a chair near the window with a coffee and the particular tired vigilance of someone at the end of a long shift. He nodded when Lucien came in. Lucien nodded back and sat down on the other side of the room. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and looked at the floor and did nothing for a while. His phone had 12 messages. He didn't read them. He knew what most of them were. Sloane with the post-operation report, the field team leads with personnel and equipment status, the first layer of legal and organizational fallout from a night that would require days of careful management to contain. All of it real, all of it requiring his attention, none of it requiring his attention right now. He looked at the cut on the back of his left hand. Dry now, crusted, a thin dark line across his knuckles. His shoulder ached where the man in the warehouse had hit him, a deep, structural ache that would bloom into something visible by tomorrow. His knees hurt from the drop to the concrete floor. He was 44 years old, and his body was informing him, with the blunt honesty of a body that had been pushed past what it was designed for, that the bill for tonight would be paid over the next several days. He thought about Darius Cross. Not with anger. He'd expected anger, had been prepared for it. The clean, simple fuel of it, the thing that made the next step obvious. But what he'd felt in the warehouse, looking at Darius's face at the end, wasn't anger. It was something more like recognition. The specific, uncomfortable recognition of seeing in another person a version of what you were capable of, reflected back without flattery. Darius had loved his father, had built 4 years of his life around the architecture of that loss, had turned grief into infrastructure, had made it functional and directed and purposeful in the way that only the most dangerous kind of grief could be. He had hurt people. He had used people. He had taken Harlan's weakness and Naomi's pain and Lucien's own emotional negligence and assembled them into a machine. And at the end, when the machine had run its course and he was standing with his hands behind his back, the thing on his face wasn't the face of a man who had lost. It was the face of a man who was finally done carrying something. Lucien understood that, which was the uncomfortable part. He understood it because he'd spent 2 years carrying something himself. Not grief, but its quieter relative. The accumulated weight of a life he'd built so thoroughly around control and distance that he'd hollowed out the center of it without noticing. He'd managed everything. Managed his organization, managed his security, managed his public face, managed the careful architecture of a marriage to a woman he loved in whatever way he was capable of loving, which was, he understood now, a partial way. A way that kept her present without letting her matter in the places where mattering was dangerous. He had been managing her for 2 years, and she had driven through a rainstorm to tell him he was going to be a father. The thing that moved through him then wasn't guilt exactly, though guilt was part of it. It was older and more structural than guilt. It was the specific sensation of understanding something about yourself that you cannot ununderstand. The door that once opened changes the shape of every room you've ever been in. He had not been a good husband, not bad in the dramatic ways that made for clean moral accounting, not cruel, not dishonest in the obvious sense, not absent in ways he could have been called to account for in any external forum. Bad in the quiet, erosive way, the way that left marks you only saw when you looked directly at them in sufficient light. He sat with that. He didn't move away from it. He let it be true in the room with him, which was different from the way he normally handled true things he didn't like. Naomi Cross was in a small conference room on the second floor of the same building Lucian had used for his pre-dawn tactical meeting, which Sloan had converted into a temporary holding space with the addition of 2 chairs, a table, and a woman named Vera, who had the kind of demeanor that communicated, without aggression, that leaving was not currently an option. Sloan had been with her for 40 minutes when she called Lucian just after 6. "She's talking," Sloan said. "Voluntarily. She doesn't need pressure." "What is she saying?" "She wants to explain the whole thing, how Darius approached her, what he asked her to do, what she agreed to and what she didn't." A pause. "She says she didn't know about the contractors, the 2 men on the highway. She says Darius told her the operation was a surveillance job, that he wanted to know Celeste's movements, nothing physical." "Do you believe her?" Sloan was quiet for a second. "I believe she believed it. Whether she asked enough questions to deserve that belief is a different issue." "What did she know about Harlan?" "She knew Darius had an asset inside. She didn't know it was Harlan specifically. She says Darius was careful about compartmentalization. Nobody knew the full picture except him." Lucian thought about that. The architecture of it again. The way Darius had kept each piece separate. Harlan didn't know about Naomi's role. Naomi didn't know about the contractors. The contractors didn't know about the warehouse's primary function. Everyone operating with partial information, which meant everyone's culpability was partial, which meant the only person holding the entire structure together was Darius himself. Strategic and lonely. The loneliness of being the only person in a room who knows where all the walls are. "The intelligence she gave me," Lucian said. "The original information about the competing organization. Is it clean?" "As far as we can verify. The competing organization she identified is real, the activity she described is accurate, and they've moved on at least 2 of the locations she flagged." Another pause. "Darius sacrificed real operational intelligence to build her credibility with you. He was serious about this." "He was serious about this for 4 years, Lucian said. "Serious is probably not the right word." "What do you want to do with her?" Lucian looked at the waiting room wall. "Ask her about the boat," he said. "The one at Slip 44. Whether Darius had a contingency plan to use it, who else knew about it, what he would have done if the waterfront operation had failed." "She already mentioned the boat without prompting," Sloan said. "She says Darius always kept it ready, that it was psychological. He liked knowing there was an exit. She says he talked about it like it was a door he never planned to use but needed to know existed." Lucian thought about that for a moment. "He was building himself an ending," he said. "Not an escape. He wasn't planning to run." "No," Sloan said. "I don't think he was." After he hung up, Lucian sat for another moment, and then he did something he hadn't planned to do. He called Harlan. Not the number in his regular contacts. That number went to whatever device was sitting in the evidence storage right now. He called the secure line of the holding facility where Harlan was being kept, and after a brief exchange with the duty officer, Harlan's voice came on the line. It sounded like a man who had slept, which was not what Lucian had expected. "How is she?" Harlan said. Before anything else, that was what he said. "She's fine," Lucian said. "The baby is fine." A long exhale on the other end of the line. "I need to ask you something," Lucian said. "And I need you to be honest with me the way you were honest last night, because the honest version is the only one I have any use for." "Ask." "The 3 years," Lucian said. "The money. Was it only for Iris?" Silence. "Yes," Harlan said. "I know how that sounds. I know that's what everyone says, but yes." "I believe you," Lucian said. "That's not why I'm asking." "Then why?" "Because I want to know if you came to me at any point, if you thought about it, if there was a moment where you almost asked for help instead of taking it." A very long pause. "Twice," Harlan said. "The first time was when the bills first started coming in and the arithmetic first stopped working. I sat outside your office for 20 minutes and then I left because I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you'd see it as weakness. I thought you'd look at me differently. I'd spent 18 years making sure you never had to look at me differently." And the second time. 6 months ago, when Darius first made contact and I was still in the window where I could have refused and told you, and— Another stop. "I almost called you. I had the phone in my hand and I thought the same thing, that you'd see it as weakness, That you'd look at me like I was something smaller than what I'd been. Lucian sat with that. I would have helped you, he said. With Iris, with the bills. I would have helped you, Harlan. I know that now. You knew it then. A pause. I knew it was possible, Harlan said. That's not the same as knowing it. Lucian thought about Celeste driving through a rainstorm because she needed to see his face when she told him something important. He thought about what it meant that the people closest to him had learned, through accumulation of small experiences, to expect his management rather than his presence. I know, he said. He hung up and looked at his hands. Celeste was moved to a private room on the 4th floor just after 7. It was a better room than the exam room, a window, a chair beside the bed, morning light beginning to come in at the angle that meant the sun had actually cleared the horizon and the city was no longer pre-dawn, but actually formally day. Dana arrived at 7:30 with a bag from the 24-hour pharmacy 2 blocks away, a toothbrush, face wash, a clean shirt, dry socks. The specific contents of a bag assembled by someone who knew another person well enough to know what they'd need after a bad night without having to be told. She set the bag on the chair and looked at Celeste in the bed and said, "You look terrible." "I know," Celeste said. "The baby?" "Fine. Heartbeat is strong. Reeves wants me here until noon, then I can go." "Go where?" Dana said, not unkindly. Celeste looked at the window. The light coming through it was the particular gold of early morning, the kind that made everything look temporarily more significant than it was. "I don't know yet," she said. "Not back to the estate. Not yet. Maybe not." She stopped. "I don't know." Dana sat in the chair. She didn't offer an opinion, which was one of the things Celeste had always valued about her. The restraint of someone who understood that some situations weren't improved by opinions. "He's here," Dana said. "In the waiting room. He's been there since you came in." "I know. Do you want me to ask him to leave?" Celeste was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Not yet." They sat together in the morning light, not talking, which was its own kind of conversation. Lucienne was still in the waiting room when Reeves came to find him just before 8. She sat down across from him with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at him with the direct, non-performative assessment of a physician who dealt with people in extremis regularly enough that she'd stopped using softening language. "She's stable," Reeves said. "Both of them. The baby is measuring well. No signs of trauma-related complications." "Thank you," he said. Reeves looked at him for a moment. "She's been my patient for 2 years," she said. "I want to be clear that I'm not going to tell you anything she hasn't authorized me to tell you. What I'm about to say is general." He waited. "Stress at this stage isn't invisible," Reeves said. "The body records it. It doesn't always show up immediately, and it doesn't always show up in ways that look like what it is. But it accumulates." She paused. "Whatever her life looks like going forward, it needs to have less of what the last several months have apparently had. I'm not going to tell you what that means specifically, but I need you to hear that it is medically relevant and not abstract." He heard it. "Yes." She stood. "You can go in when she says so, not before." She left. He sat for a while longer, then he went to the window at the end of the corridor and looked at the city coming awake in the morning, the traffic building on the street below, the first full light of day on the buildings across from the hospital, the ordinary, extraordinary persistence of a city that had no idea what had moved through its darker corners last night and wouldn't need to know. His phone showed 23 messages now. He read Sloane's first. The operational summary was clean. All 6 of Darius's men in custody, the waterfront warehouse secured, the shell company documentation Harlan had provided delivered to the legal team. Darius himself was being held pending the formal process that would take the situation out of Lucian's hands and into a different kind of machinery, which was the right outcome, which meant something had worked the way it was supposed to work for once. Sloane's last line said, "Harlan's daughter is fine. Guard is still on her room." The envelope was delivered. He sent back 2 words, "Good work." He read Cole's message next. It was longer than it needed to be, thorough in the way of someone who was still managing the adrenaline of a long night and channeling it into documentation. Cole had pulled every access log, every communication record, every piece of electronic evidence from the intrusions into Celeste's data and organized it into a package that would be useful for exactly the kind of formal process that Darius Cross was now entering. At the end of the message, Cole had written, "I don't know if this is appropriate to say, but I'm glad she made it out. I've been monitoring the hospital perimeter. Let me know when she's discharged and I'll stand down." Lucian looked at that for a moment. A 26-year-old who had bypassed protocol in the middle of the night because his instincts told him something was wrong, had made a clean decision and held to it all the way through, and was now sitting at a monitor somewhere, making sure the story ended the right way. He wrote back, "It's appropriate, thank you." Then he put the phone in his pocket and waited. Celeste asked for him just after 9. Dana was in the cafeteria when the nurse came to the waiting room, and it was just Lucian who followed the nurse down the corridor to the private room and knocked on the open door and waited for her to tell him to come in. She was sitting up in the bed, wearing the clean shirt Dana had brought. Her hair was still damp from where she'd washed it in the room's small bathroom, pushed back from her face without any particular arrangement. The broken shoe was in the corner. The ultrasound photograph was on the nightstand, propped against the water glass, facing the room. He came in and sat in the chair beside the bed. They were quiet for a moment. "Harlan Voss," she said. "Yes." "He was the one who—" She stopped, reorganized. "He fed them my information, my schedule, the clinic." "Yes." She absorbed that. He watched her do it. The particular process of fitting a betrayal into the existing structure of what you knew, which changed the structure, which required a moment of sitting with the changed version. Why? His daughter is sick. He needed money. He made choices he shouldn't have, and someone found out about those choices and used them against him. He paused. He tried to end it at the last moment. He sent a warning through channels that got you the texts on the highway. She looked at the window. "The texts," she said. "That was him. Indirectly. He leaked my information and then warned me." "Yes." She was quiet for a while. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. "Neither do I," Lucien said. "Not entirely." She looked at him. "His daughter, is she—" "She's safe. She's being looked after." Something moved across Celeste's face. Complicated. The particular complication of someone absorbing the full humanity of a situation that would have been simpler with a clean villain. "Okay," she said. "Not forgiveness, not condemnation, just the acknowledgement of something real and difficult." They were quiet again. "The woman," Celeste said, "at the gate. The woman you were with." He'd been waiting for this. He'd known it was coming, and he'd prepared for it. Not prepared what to say, specifically, but prepared to say it without deflection, without management, without the careful architecture of explanation he'd built around uncomfortable things for so long it had become automatic. "Her name is Naomi Cross," he said. "She's Darius's sister. He sent her to me 2 weeks ago with information I needed. Information that was accurate, which was the point. He was building her credibility so I'd trust her, so she'd have reason to be at the estate, so you'd see her there." He paused. "She was never... What you saw wasn't what it looked like." Celeste looked at him steadily. "You're sure?" "Yes." "Because what it looked like was—" "I know what it looked like," he said. "I know exactly what it looked like from where you were sitting, and I'm telling you it wasn't that." She held his gaze for a long moment. He held hers. This was the kind of exchange that couldn't be managed. It required just sitting in it until it resolved, and it resolved in its own time. "Okay," she said finally. "Celeste, I believe you," she said. "That's what okay means." A pause. "It doesn't fix everything else, but I believe you about that specific thing." He nodded. "The gate," she said. "Your orders. You told them not to let me in." "Yes." "Why?" He thought about how to say this. He'd had hours in this waiting room to think about how to say this, and what he'd arrived at was that there was no version of it that didn't require him to say something true and uncomfortable without apology. "Because I'd been managing the situation with Naomi Cross, and I didn't want you to see her there without context, and I chose—" He stopped. "I chose to control the situation instead of talking to you. I gave an order that kept you out of your own house because it was easier than having a conversation. I was going to have eventually anyway." She didn't say anything. "That's not a justification," he said. That's just what it was." She looked at her hands in her lap. The morning light was fully in the room now, uncomplicated, clear. "You've been doing that for 2 years," she said. "Managing situations instead of talking to me." "Yes." I knew, she said. I knew you were doing it, and I let it happen because I kept thinking it was temporary, that it was the pressure of a particular moment, that the next month would be different. She looked up. It was never temporary. It was just how you were. Yes, he said again. Is that how you're going to keep being? He looked at her. I don't know, he said. I think I'm capable of different. I don't think I can prove that with words in a hospital room. She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face, but it was close. That's the first honest thing I've heard you say in probably a year. He sat with that. I'm not coming back to the estate, she said. Not now. Not until I know. Not until things are different in ways I can actually see and not just hear about. I know. I want somewhere of my own, a place that's mine, where I can make decisions about what my life looks like without those decisions being... She stopped. Without feeling like I'm living inside someone else's project. I'll find you a place, he said. I'll find myself a place, she said. You can help pay for it. That's a different thing. He almost said something, stopped himself. Let it be what it was. The baby, she said. We're going to have to figure out what that means, what our roles are, what we tell each other and when, what access looks like. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. The gesture had become natural to her in the last several hours, the way new instincts installed themselves quickly when they were necessary. I want this child to know you. I want them to grow up knowing you're their father. But I need to know that you're not going to manage them the way you managed me. I'm not going to manage them, he said. How do I know that? You don't, he said. Not yet. He looked at her directly. You know it the same way I know you're going to be all right. You watch and you pay attention and you let the evidence accumulate. There's no shortcut. She looked at him for a long time. No, she said. There isn't. They were quiet for a while, both of them, in the morning light of a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic, and Dana's pharmacy bag, and the faint metallic edge of a city that was fully awake now, going about its day with no knowledge of what had been decided in its corridors and warehouses and dark stretches of highway through the night. The monitor beside the bed continued its steady, small rhythm. Neither of them looked at it, but both of them heard it. Darius Cross was transferred to county custody at 10:17 that morning. He walked from the vehicle into the facility with his hands cuffed in front of him and his face carrying the particular blankness of someone who had already, somewhere in the previous hours, made his peace with where he was. He didn't resist. He didn't speak to the officers beyond what was required. He looked, to anyone watching, like a man completing a journey rather than beginning a punishment. The detective who processed him, a woman named Park, who had been doing this work for 16 years and had developed a reliable instinct for the interior lives of people she booked, noted in her report that he had asked once whether the woman who had been held in the warehouse was alive and unharmed. When told yes, he had nodded. He hadn't asked anything else. Naomi Cross left the conference room at 11. Sloan had gotten from her everything she was going to get. The full account of her involvement, the specific information she'd passed, the timeline of her contact with Darius, the names of intermediaries she'd used. All of it useful. All of it delivered with the tired cooperation of someone who had made a decision and was following it through. At the door, Naomi stopped. She turned to Sloan. My brother, she said. Is he... He's alive, Sloan said, in custody. Naomi nodded, a complicated nod, the kind that contained more than one feeling and wasn't trying to hide that. He called me last night, she said, after the warehouse, before you brought me in. He called me and I didn't answer. Sloan waited. I don't know if that means I made the right choice, Naomi said. I don't know if there was a right choice. She looked at her hands. I just know I couldn't answer. She left. Sloan stood in the doorway of the empty conference room and wrote in her notes, subject fully cooperative. No further operational security risk. Recommend standard monitoring for 6 months, then reassess. She underlined fully cooperative. Then she closed the notebook and went to find coffee. Celeste was discharged at noon as Reeves had promised. Dana brought the car around. The morning had become afternoon while they weren't looking. The specific alchemy of hospital time, which moved differently than regular time, slower and faster, in alternating ways that always disoriented people when they stepped back into the ordinary world. Lucien walked her to the entrance. They stood at the door for a moment, him on the inside, her about to step through. Dana's car was at the curb, visible through the glass doors. "I'll send you the address," Celeste said, "when I find a place. So you know where I am." "Thank you," he said. "The appointments," she said, "the prenatal appointments. I'll tell you when they are, if you want to come to some of them." "I want to come," he said. She nodded. "Then come." She looked at him one final time in the way she'd been looking at him since the warehouse, with the eyes of someone who was seeing clearly, who had decided to see clearly, and was maintaining that decision even when it was harder than the alternative. "You came," she said. She'd said it first in the warehouse, when he opened the door. She was saying it again now, and it meant something different the second time. Not just the physical fact of arriving, but something larger, something that had to do with what it meant to finally, after a very long time, actually show up. "Yeah," he said. She pushed through the door into the afternoon light. He stood at the glass and watched her cross to the car. The broken-heeled shoe replaced by a pair of flat shoes from Dana's pharmacy bag. Her coat buttoned against the October air, her hand going briefly to her coat pocket as she walked, confirming by feel what she already knew was there. Dana helped her in. The car pulled away. He watched it until it turned the corner. Then he stood in the entrance of Mercy General Hospital on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October, with the city going on around him the way it always did, indifferent and continuous. And he felt the full weight of a night that had cost him more than money or operational security or the careful architecture he'd built around his life. It had cost him the last of his certainty about who he was, which was, he understood, standing in that entrance with the afternoon light on the glass, probably necessary. Probably the only thing that had been necessary all along. 6 weeks later, he found a parking space on a quiet street in a neighborhood he'd never had reason to be in before. The building was a converted brownstone, 4 stories, with a small garden at the entrance that someone was clearly tending with attention. The kind of garden that didn't happen by accident, that required regular intention. He'd driven past it twice before parking, not because he'd had trouble finding it, but because he'd needed the extra minutes. He rang the bell for apartment 3B. Celeste's voice through the intercom. "Come up." The stairway was narrow and the third-floor landing smelled like someone on the second floor was cooking something with garlic and olive oil. He knocked on the door of 3B and she opened it before he'd fully finished knocking. She looked different. Not dramatically. She was herself, she was recognizably Celeste. But there was something in her face that had settled, the particular settling that happened when a person found themselves in a space that matched them. She was wearing a loose sweater that was slightly too large, and her hair was down, and she looked like someone in the early stages of building something she'd chosen herself. "Come in," she said. "I made coffee." He came in. The apartment was not large. It had the slightly improvised quality of a space in the process of becoming. Some furniture that was clearly new, some things he recognized from storage, a bookshelf that was half full, a print on the wall that was slightly crooked and hadn't been straightened yet, either because she hadn't noticed or because she'd decided to leave it. He suspected the latter. She handed him coffee in a mug he didn't recognize. They sat at the small kitchen table. "Reeves said everything looks good," she said, "from last week's appointment." "I know. She sent me the summary. She told me she was going to." A pause. "I told her it was okay." He nodded. She wrapped both hands around her own mug. Outside the kitchen window, the small building's courtyard was visible, a tree that had mostly dropped its leaves, a bench, someone's bicycle leaned against the wall. The ordinary geography of a life in a place. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I want to tell this child. Eventually, when they're old enough to ask." She looked at the window. "About who their parents were to each other." He waited. "I don't want to tell a clean version," she said. "I don't want the version where everything happened for a reason and everyone learned their lesson and the hard parts were worth it, because look how everything turned out." She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "I want to tell them the true version, that 2 people tried to love each other and did it badly for a while, and then something happened that forced them to be honest. And honest was harder than anything that came before it, and that they were still figuring it out." "That's a complicated story to tell a child," he said. "All the true ones are," she said. He looked at his coffee. "What do you want from me?" he said. "Right now, not eventually, just right now." She thought about it genuinely. He could see her actually considering it, not reaching for an answer but finding one. "Show up," she said. "The appointments. Decisions about the baby. When I ask you something, answer honestly. When you're managing something you should be saying out loud, say it out loud instead." She paused. "And don't make promises about what you're going to be. Just be things. Let me see them." "Okay," he said. "That's it. That's enough," he said. She almost smiled. Again, the almost. He was learning to read the almost as its own thing, not the absence of the smile, but a different expression that existed in the same territory. They drank their coffee. Outside, the October afternoon was the kind of cold that felt deliberate, purposeful cold, the kind that stripped everything back to essentials and left the shapes of things visible, the bare trees and the clear sky and the particular quality of light that existed only in the weeks when the year was deciding to become itself again. He stayed for an hour. When he left, he stood on the sidewalk in front of the brownstone for a moment and looked up at the third-floor window where he could see the faint light of the kitchen, the outline of the slightly crooked print on the wall, the ordinary interior of a life being built on honest terms. He walked to his car. He drove back through the city, not to the estate, not yet. He drove the long way, through neighborhoods. He rarely had reason to travel, through the industrial district with its wet streets and chain-link fences, past the gas station on the industrial stretch that a woman had walked into on a rainy night and borrowed a phone and drunk a cup of coffee from a stranger who hadn't asked questions. He drove past it slowly. The same attendant was there, visible through the glass, sitting with his phone. The same orange-white glow of the sign. Lucian drove on. He drove until the city ran out of new things to show him, and then he turned back toward whatever home had become now. Not the estate with its iron gates and its managed distances, but the idea of it, the project of it, the daily unremarkable work of becoming someone who deserved what he was trying not to lose. The city moved around him, indifferent and alive. Somewhere across it, in a third-floor apartment with a slightly crooked print on the wall, a heartbeat continued its small, steady, entirely serious work. And that was enough. For now, that was enough.